All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it was already touched upon in the last conversation, but I just want to express my gratitude for everyone who's made this event possible today. I know that all of the West Point cadets who are here today are extremely thankful for that opportunity. That being said, sir, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for agreeing to share your expertise with us. So as we just heard, you've obviously had a very long and interesting career in the Army, including 37 years of service, with 10 of those being spent in Europe. Given that experience, could you talk to us a little bit about insights about Europe at large, and then also Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that's an anomaly? That's a hard word. Anomaly with respect to what we've seen in the last 70 years.
Got it. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. The first thing I want to say, though, is the only reason I said I'd come do this is because I told them I needed a smart cadet to be up here with me, and they gave me the best. So Cadet Wurdack here is going to be shepherding through this. I also have to apologize for gimping up here with my leg. I had a very bad bicycling accident a few months ago and broke my leg in several places, so I'm recovering. And my leg is shorter on the right side, so I can dance better, but I keep going in circles, so I may do that a little bit during my presentation today too. Europe. As Cadet Wurdack said, I've spent a total of 10 years in Europe. My wife spent 12 years there. Actually, it was 9 years, because 3 of the years that I was assigned to Europe, we were deployed to other places. The 3 times I was assigned there was coming out of West Point in 1975 during the time of the Cold War, when we had the Imperial Army of the Rhine, probably about 350,000 US soldiers stationed in Germany and various parts of Europe, so it was a very different Cold War force. I came back in 1988 as a major, Cavalry Squadron S3, and we were deployed out of Europe to go to Desert Storm at the time. But Europe at that point, I was actually a cavalryman on the border between West Germany and Czechoslovakia at the time, not the Czech Republic, when the wall came down. So manning a border patrol and watching history being made as freedom occurred was really fascinating. And at the time, there were 16 members of NATO. Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about that in just a second too. My third time over there was in 2002. Again, I was assigned to Europe, but spent 1 day in Hanau as an assistant division commander, and then 15 months in Iraq as an assistant division commander for the 1st Armored Division. So that tour doesn't count at all. But I came back and then went to the training center at Grafenwehr as the commander of the training center. And I'm going to dwell on that for a second, because my boss, when I took command of the training center at Grafenwehr, which is a wonderful place for any of you who have been there, it's even better today, said, hey, for the last 50 years, we have trained U.S. Army forces. He said that the footprint of Europe is changing. We are now reaching out based on the wall coming down 10 years earlier, and we want to train multinational forces at this place. So we opened up Grafenwehr to every European force under the sun, and even though at the time the number of NATO members had increased from 16 to, I think at about that time it was 24 or 25, it's now 32. At that point, we were seeing not just NATO members, but our partner countries in Europe coming in to train. 3 of the biggest that came in early were Poland, Georgia, and Ukraine. They wanted to train with us. And part of the rationale behind that is their governments believed that they could use our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were asking for partner member nations, they could use that opportunity to transform their military force. So starting in 2004, when I came back from Iraq and took command of the training center at Grafenwehr, we were already beginning to see a tide change in Europe. Now, You will hear on the news that the United States pushed people into NATO. Nothing could be further from the truth. These were member states of the old Soviet Republic, the old Warsaw Pact, who were saying they wanted a new approach to security. And they had also lived under the onus of the old Soviet state, Russia, and they never wanted to go back. Some were more prepared to join NATO than others. Ukraine at the time was not prepared at all. There was massive, as well as Georgia and a few others, there was massive corruption inside the Ukrainian state and the Georgian state and others. So a lot of European nations said, push back. When you attempt to join NATO, there's something called the MAP, the Members Access Plan. So a nation that's attempting to become a member of NATO will say, here is our status economically, politically, geographically, diplomatically, and here's what we think we need to do over the next several years to meet all the requirements of joining NATO. The map for Ukraine was stopped on multiple occasions because of the corruption within that state. What we have seen recently, and it turned in 2014, truthfully, with the invasion of, the illegal invasion, I should say, of Crimea and the Donbass region by Russia, Ukraine got more serious about stamping out corruption and forming their military. And one of the things I'd say proudly, it was the U.S. Army Europe, the U.S. Air Force Europe, Special Operations Command Europe, not so much the Navy, even though they were working with the Ukrainian Navy to a degree, but the first three that I mentioned, Special Ops, Air Force, and Army, were doing some magnificent work with helping transform the Ukrainian military. And that transformation of the military also spilled over into the transformation of the government and the elimination of corruption. I can talk ad nauseum about my Ukrainian partner, Lieutenant General Hennady Vorobyov, who I spent a vast amount of time with, both in Yavoriv and Lviv and his hometown of Kharkiv. And he also spent a lot of time with me in Heidelberg and Grafenwehr training the Ukrainian military. We had quite a few German beers, even more Ukrainian vodka. Part of the role of a senior military leader is eating and drinking for his country, which I dutifully did and was proud to do. But that's kind of the introduction in terms of Ukraine and the associated changes in the NATO footprint, which we've seen over the last 6 months, with some increased emphasis on countries not only wanting to join NATO, but other countries saying, we really need to get serious about it again. Because they were serious about it during the Cold War, not so much since 1990 until about February 24th were they serious about it. Sorry for that long answer.
That's awesome, sir. So you just touched on sort of the changes in Europe that have driven Russia to choose to invade now. Could you talk to us a little bit about sort of the different key elements of the phases of the conflict?
Yeah, phases of the conflict. There have been 3 phases so far. We're about to go into a 4th, I think. Phase 1 was a really poorly planned military operation conducted by Russia on 9 different axes of approach with about 190,000 soldiers, not near enough to do what they needed to do. And that's where truthfully, I said in the very beginning they're going to fail because they just did not have enough force, something the Army calls a troop-to-task relationship. You know, how many troops do you have? What's the task you have to perform? Do they match? Russia never matched that. 190,000 sounds like a lot, but when you're talking about not only the attack on 9 different axes of approach, but also seizing and securing major population centers. You know, the city of Hartford, right outside the door of this place, has 120,000 people about in its population. That's a small city in some of the places that Russia tried to occupy in Ukraine. When you try and seize a city like Kharkiv, which is about the size of Philadelphia, or let's say Kyiv, which is about the size of the city of Chicago, you need a very large force. Russia did not have that. So we saw the end of phase one, which started on 24 February. Mr. Putin and his generals decided, yeah, we need to go into phase two, which started the early part of April, where they were just focused primarily on the Donbass, the two oblasts, as they call them, which are sort of like states or provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, and saying, hey, let's expand, Russia said, let's expand our occupation and our seizure of those two oblasts. Unfortunately, over the last 8 years or so, Ukraine has been fighting a stalemate out there, a defensive battle, because they didn't want to, pardon my language, piss off the Russians. They never went on the offensive. They were just defending their borders in an act of defense after Russia pulled in with their little green men in 2014. So after that occurred, the Russian artillery was significant in terms of hitting Ukrainian population centers. One of the things I'd mentioned in phase two of this operation, there's intelligence estimates today that said about 70% of Russian artillery and missile strikes were on civilian areas. 70%. So that tells you that their focus on a military campaign was lacking. All they were trying to do was kill civilians, to create chaos, terrorism among the Ukrainian state, and cause the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, President Zelensky, to say, do I give up because my civilians are suffering, or do I execute a military campaign? And I think President Zelensky has masterfully balanced those two, because that's what a head of state does. Unfortunately, it's also caused literally tens of thousands of deaths as a result of Russian war crimes. And I'm going to say that emphatically. These are war crimes when you target civilians. That phase ended about less than 30 days ago, when Ukraine started, I won't call them counteroffensives, because a counteroffensive implies a very large military operation. That's not what occurred the first week in September. What occurred was some hasty attacks in the south, in the Kherson region, and some reconnaissance in force in preparation for an attack in the northern region of Kharkiv. And luckily, because of, I think, some very good intelligence that the Ukrainian forces were getting from the US and NATO, they were able to find what the Army calls a seam, and they drove right through that seam in what we have sometimes called a thunder run. But it took Russia by complete surprise, and Ukraine was able to occupy more territory, not only in the Kharkiv Oblast, but also threatening Donetsk and Luhansk, while simultaneously continuing to conduct smaller scale operations in the south, which, watch the south, because we're going to see more activity there over the next couple of weeks. And I think, I still believe that we will see a major, how do I want to say this? We will see, I'll use the non-doctrinal term, the bagging of a lot of Russian forces, because currently they have between 5,000 and 15,000 forces with their backs to the Dnieper River, and they have no way to escape. So I think Ukraine is going to have another major victory in the south sometime soon. So we're now in phase 4. What's going to happen next is interesting, with Mr. Putin suggesting that he's going to mobilize 300,000, and there's a caveat within the decree that he said yesterday, way down in the issuance of that decree. We all are focusing on 300,000 mobilized. In that decree, there's an effort to recruit close to 1 million Russian soldiers. They'll never get there. I think this is a turning point where Mr. Putin will start seeing massive demonstrations by his population, by the mothers of Russian soldiers, because they have lost, by estimates, anywhere between 50 and 70,000 troops in the first 6 months of this campaign, which is just horrendous. That's a lot of soldiers to lose in combat.
Right, sir, I think...
Oh, and there's a phase 5 coming in the future. The phase 5 is going to be the support by the United States and NATO for the transformation of the Ukrainian military into a modern-day, technologically advanced force. How long that will take, I don't know. In Poland, it took about 10 years. The Polish military is a modern, transformed force that started in about 2003 or 4. They are now becoming, I think, Poland is becoming one of the leaders of the European nations. And we'll see in the long term, I think Poland and Ukraine will share that leadership in a very unique way.
Awesome.
That's a prediction. Don't write it down. Okay.
All right, sir, I thought you...
Am I talking too much?
No, I don't think so, sir.
I'm sorry. All right.
I'm entranced. I'm
Okay,
loving
good.
it. So you brought up a really interesting point, I think, about sort of this balance that President Zelensky has been trying to manage between a military operation and civilian well-being. I'm sure that that's included a lot of trial and error over the last 6 months. Could you talk to us a little bit about what we've learned in these 6 months of trial and error?
Oh man, you know, listening to the previous discussion about Taiwan and China was pretty fascinating because they are literally as different as apples and tennis rackets. What we have learned so many things from what we teach at the War College are the 4 elements of national power. It's called the DIME methodology: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. We have learned so many things in each one of those areas from both a U.S. national standpoint, but also from a NATO standpoint, that the lessons learned over the last 6 months have been, there's no other word, but gargantuan. There's a lot to be garnered from the military campaign, and I'm sure our Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine, Special Operators are pulling lessons learned right now, or lessons observed, and they're going to apply those. But from the other elements of national power, from a strategic standpoint, the diplomacy, information, and economic approaches to this war by both the United States and NATO have just been phenomenal. And it would take a whole nother day to even touch some of those and describe what they've been. But I'll give you 2. One is, as was stated in the previous panel, sanctions do work. They failed miserably in Iraq. They have failed miserably against Russia since 2014 in their invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, but they are working now. We are at the 214th day of this conflict, so about 6 months plus. If we hearken back to February, it probably went unnoticed, but a lot of people said at the time, it will take about 6 months for the sanctions to kick in. We're there now, and they are kicking in a big way. Russia's economy is in the toilet. Their GDP has been reduced by close to 3 times what it was even during an age of COVID and some of the other things. Their ability to produce things, to repair their military equipment, to mobilize their population has been reduced from an economic standpoint. The information campaign that has been waged in this conflict, both strategically, operationally, and tactically, has a bevy of lessons learned in and of themselves. How the Biden administration handled the early intelligence that they received, let's just put it that way. How they applied what they knew to shaping the events, even to the surprise of Ukraine, by the way. Remember, at the early stages, Mr. Zelensky did not think Russia was going to attack across his border. because he saw, like so many did, it would be foolish if they did that. Sure was, but they did it anyway. There have been multiple things that that Russia has done that have been foolish that Mr. Putin has still done, which unfortunately may portend some foolish things in the future too.
So just to backtrack a little bit, you talked earlier about sort of the changing roles of Poland and Ukraine in Europe. So along those lines, how do you see the conclusion of the conflict in Ukraine affecting the political structure of Europe?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a very, I'm an armor officer, I'm a tanker, so I'm going to give you a tanker's answer to that. I don't know.
Okay.
You can't predict the end of this conflict, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, because every time you think you have an insight, the most important phrase that I remember being taught by a mentor of mine was, the enemy gets a vote. Let me say that again if you want to write this down. The enemy gets a vote. So you can't predict the end of any conflict, even if it's seemingly one-sided. Mr. Putin may do something tomorrow or today that is just outright insane. That's a possibility. I don't know if it's a probability, but it's a possibility. And we can talk about nukes because I'm sure a lot of people have a question on that. At the same time he could do that, tomorrow there could be a coup in Russia. Or there could be another thunder run by the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass and take more territory. Or there could be multiple strikes in Crimea. I don't know. But all those things will have an effect on the conflict. One of the things that I'm watching very closely also is the protest throughout Russia today, and yesterday, and tomorrow. I learned early on in my life, not just my military career, don't ever piss off mom. And you have a lot of pissed off Russian mothers right now. By the way, that's military strategy right there, don't
All right, well, I'm not sure that the tanker's answer is going to cut it for my exams this year, but maybe I'll try it.
Try it, give it a shot. What do you think? That won't work, yeah, okay.
No, I don't think so,
Okay.
but it's worth a shot. So kind of shifting gears again, in light of the invasion of Ukraine, excuse me, I was sick a little while ago, so there's still a remnant cough.
Oh,
but
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Anyway, in light of the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of European countries have committed to more defense spending. For example, the German Chancellor has pledged an extra $112 billion to defense
Security,
spending.
yeah.
Exactly. And how do you think that the predicted energy crisis, the effects of which are currently setting in, is going to affect the ability of European countries to meet those commitments?
Can I go back to my tanker's answer for that? I don't know.
I think it works here, sir.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. A blessing of my life and a luck of my life is I happen to be a classmate, a West Point classmate with the current Secretary of Defense. Lloyd Austin is not only, Secretary Austin is not only a classmate and a friend, but I think a very good Secretary of Defense. You know, he exemplifies be more than you appear to be. He has been masterful in terms of handling the other defense ministers within Europe and NATO. And when I say handling, that's not a bad term. I'm talking about collaborating and coordinating their actions. But yes, there has been a rapid shift in terms of European states contributing more to their defense spending because they see a threat. That, I think, will continue. Will that reflect in the population of the European nations? I don't know, because it gets, having lived in Europe for 12 years, or 9 of those 12 years, it gets cold in Europe during the wintertime, really cold. But here's the interest, compare this. When our gas prices went to $5 a gallon, American citizens went nuts. Europe has been paying close to the equivalent of $9 to $10 a gallon since about 1998. If it increases, and that's, by the way, why they have more electric vehicles and charging stations and solar panels than we do, because they've seen the effects of high energy prices. We are just now beginning to see that. So what Europe has not done for the most part is change their household heating source. It's still oil. You still have big tanks in most German homes, as you well know, of oil in the basement that you fill up once a year. So I don't know what the energy extortion by Russia will do, but I do know that the current administration, behind the scenes, and no one's noticed this, has gone to other countries to attempt to supply Europe with oil over the last 4 months. And what we heard yesterday, the German government announced that they have 90% of their required energy supplies for this winter. Wait a minute, what? How'd that happen? A lot of behind the scenes stuff going on. So that was I can't remember where I read that, but it was fascinating to say that they were ready to admit that. That's a big deal. Will other countries in Europe do that? I don't know. Will Ukraine be able to do that? No. We're already seeing not only the exit of Ukrainian citizens from big towns because of the war, we're also seeing, unfortunately, the exit of Ukrainian citizens from those towns to the local rural areas because they think they can survive in villages better than they can survive in apartment buildings. And when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, you can't start a wood fire in an apartment building to stay warm. You can in a little hovel in some little small Ukrainian village. So you're going to see a tough winter for Ukraine, I think, unless some things change on the battlefield. That's a long answer to your question. The winter is going to be tough because Russia is extorting all of Europe with energy supplies. But there have been some attempts at mitigating that extortion by NATO and the US government. Don't know if it's going to work or not. Another long answer, sorry.
That's not a problem, sir. Excuse me.
I'm trying to save your voice for you. So
I know, thank you.
Sure.
I guess my next question, we focused a lot in this discussion about Ukraine. I'm sure that's what many of you are interested in. But given your area of expertise, I was just wondering if you think that there are any other very prominent national security issues within Europe right now.
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to talk about them a little bit? A long or a short answer, sir.
Okay. I'll try and do a short answer. Yes. We are seeing some bubbling of the Serbian people in the Baltics. We are seeing, obviously, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen the conflict in a place. How many people know where Nagorno-Karabakh is? A few, good. No Americans know that. Outside of this room, outside of national security professionals, the area between Azerbaijan and Armenia is a place called Nagorno-Karabakh. It has been festering. It is a frozen conflict. It has been that way since 1990. Transnistria in Moldova is seemingly, early on it was bubbling a little bit. It's no longer. Those places, you are going to, I think we're going to see a fight for leadership, which isn't the same as a national security threat, but it's going to be interesting to see various countries and politicians in various European countries fighting for leadership within the footprint and within the area. You are going to see a migration issue continue. There's already been estimates of 7 million Ukrainians going into Romania, Moldova, Poland, other places, and that's increasing. You are going to see the effects of climate change in Europe. We're already seeing it in the northern region. When I was in Sweden in 2011, the Swedish ground force commander told me his number one concern was the North Sea approaches and the defenses of his country. And this was an army guy saying this. So the combination of Army-Navy coordination with Air Force involvement as well for all countries of NATO. And Finland's joining of NATO is fascinating. Watch the border on Finland, because they have not stopped Russian tourists yet, but I bet they will soon.
Okay.
It's time for questions.
Oh, awesome. Well,
You're off the hook.
in that regard, I guess we will switch over. Thank you so much, sir. We've got our first question over there.
This is when we get to see the people with the microphones running across the stage.
You did mention Serbia recently. I'm Robbie Svjanovic. I am a former student at Goodwin, and Svjanovic actually is Serbian. During the whole Russian imperial age, it viewed itself sort of as the protector of the Balkans. How has that changed in modern times, both during the Soviet era, as well as from the imperial era? How has the Balkans sort of changed its view, and Russia as well?
Yeah, most don't know this, but my old command, U.S. Army Europe, continues to train every 6 months a new group of American National Guard soldiers going into Kosovo. Anybody know that? Yes, that war that was supposed to be over in 1 year in 1994 is still ongoing. Or not war, but the contention, let's put it that way. So every 6 months, a new group of U.S. Army National Guard soldiers go into Kosovo. I think the U.S. will continue to see themselves as a protector of the peace in the Balkans. What is interesting to me right now is an increased aggression on the part of your home nation toward the Kosovo people. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah, I think you're going to see the continued peacekeeping or peacemaking operations in the Balkans. There's going to be, and that's why I mentioned it first, there's going to be continued tension between Serbia and Kosovo, as well as Albania, for that matter. So yeah, it is a smaller conflict, but it's a conflict nonetheless. That's the best answer I can give on that one.
Hi, I'm Cadet Zweig from the University of Connecticut. I was wondering...
Go Huskies.
Yes. So
I was told to say that sometime during the presentation. I don't know why.
There are two regions in Georgia which are like vying for sovereignty that are backed by the Russian government, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. How does the Russian conflict with Ukraine affect the outlook for these two regions?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I've been watching that very closely because I kind of thought that the people in South Ossetia and Abkhazia would sort of rise up, especially if, and Mr. Putin attempted to draw forces out of those two provinces, if you will, to support the war in Ukraine. And the Russian forces in both of those said, yeah, no thanks. We're really busy here, can't go, you know, and they never departed those two regions. So you still have sort of and I'm being a little bit flip, but you still have a Russian military presence in those two areas of Georgia, but it's tenuous. Just as is, by the way, Russian military presence in a lot of other places. So if you continue to see sort of the revolt against Putin by the mothers of Russia, and you start seeing protests becoming more and more effective, I think you will see hotspots in all the areas where Russia has forces deployed to tamp down civilian unrest. And again, that's not a prediction, it's just something to watch. because it could cause. At one point in my career, I was the war planner. The only assignment to the Pentagon I ever had was in 2000 and 2000 through 2002. A pretty interesting time there for war plans, or contingency plans as we officially call them. And the most dangerous contingency plans that we have on our books across the world, and we have a lot of contingency plans for the U.S. military, the most dangerous ones involve humanitarian crises and implosions of local populations. Those are the hardest ones to quell. So when you see a state like Russia, which spans 11 time zones, having problems at each of their borders with indigenous personnel that don't like the overwatch of Russia, there's the potential for real disaster. Ponder that one for a while when you go to sleep tonight.
Go ahead.
All right. Hi, my name is Logan Furman. I attend Pathways Academy of Technology and Design, and I'm a sophomore.
What is your school's mascot that I can say?
We have a panther.
There you go.
Yeah.
Panther. I'll take a panther over a husky any day. All right. All right. Go ahead, Panthers. Go Panthers.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is coming from someone with a bias where I actually have family and some family friends in Ukraine and Russia. So how I feel personally is Putin is sort of a loose cannon, and I'm just sort of thinking he's very much proven this during this war too. Do we have any plans on going after, like, not really going after him in particular, but doing anything about this?
Yeah. No, and I'm being flip. Don't take that as a definitive, yeah, we're going after Putin. We are going after the Russian government by saying we have information that we're releasing, we're stressing your economy, we are supporting a force that's stressing your military, and your diplomatic tools are suddenly going out the window because they have been shown as a pariah in every single international body recently. I mean, that UN, the series of UN speeches this week, you have never seen a nation get that much blowback at the UN in the last 2 decades. I mean, the last time a nation got that much blowback is when the United States went into Iraq. So no, we're not, don't take my answer as we're going after Putin, but I think we're seeing the criminal nature and the authoritarian kleptocracy, which is the Russian state today, and saying you're not going to invade other countries if we can prevent it. Thanks.
All right, so we're at about 8 minutes, which means we probably have time for about one more question with a long answer, or 2 or 3
Or
questions
6
with
with
a
a short
concrete
one.
answer.
Okay, I'll keep them short.
Thank you, General. I'm Cadet Taylor from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. I was wondering how...
Go Falcons. Yes! No.
Cheers.
Beat Air Force. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, General. I was wondering how you perceived Turkey's role in the Ukraine conflict, as the recent prisoner exchange was actually moderated by them, but at the same time, as you mentioned, what was holding Ukraine back from NATO membership was internal corruption and concerns about their government. While we've seen a lot of Eastern Europe make strides in terms of democratization, we've seen Turkey in the same amount of time make significant backslides. And I was wondering how you saw their role in this conflict, given that they are trying to broker agreements while also losing some of that unity with the rest of NATO.
Yeah, that is a great question. And for those of you cadets and ROTC and people who are studying national security, if you really want a fascinating thing that will bend your mind, study Turkey. And start by reading a book on Ataturk, and I can't remember the author, but it's about that thick. It's a great book that one of my Turkish friends gave me. And it's a fascinating history of Kemal Ataturk and how he formed the current Turkish nation. What I would say is not only the prisoner exchange, but remember they were also involved in the dynamics with the flow of wheat. So they helped stop the grain embargo. And Ukraine has at least jump-started or attempted to jump-start their economy again based on that. Turkey is, she wanted a short answer, so I'll just tell you, study Turkey. Because your daily understanding of that country will change every single day because it's hard to understand. They are a NATO nation that sometimes doesn't like to do what NATO wants to do. And we have seen that repeatedly, but at the same time, they can also become an extremely good ally. And go figure whether it's a Tuesday or a Friday, you're looking at them. And I'm serious when I say that. It's the hardest country to understand, in my view, in Europe.
All right, we do have time for one more question.
Hi, sir. Major Matt Allard, Connecticut Army National Guard. I had a specific question related to posture in Europe. So obviously we spent a lot of to posture, our current military posture in Europe. So obviously we spent a lot of time, reducing our Cold War footprint, and now obviously again we have to kind of stand up force structure and our posture. In your opinion, obviously, as an armored officer and not having a tenant unit out there as an armored brigade combat team at the moment, what do you see in the future after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Our future posture within Eastern Europe and Western Europe.
Yeah. First of all, I have to caveat that by saying that I was there for the drawdown in Europe, and it was one of the worst times in my life because I was fighting desperately to keep 2 additional brigades over there. And back then, I almost committed hara-kiri in front of the National Security Council, and it got me in trouble because I was fighting for more forces in 2011 when we were doing a pivot to Asia, which I think we're going to talk about on the next panel. But that doesn't answer your question. I think what we're going to see is continued rotational forces. There's a rotational corps headquarters in the revamped Phoenix-like 5th Corps. You will see, at least in the near term, 1, perhaps 1.5 divisions worth of combat forces. The 101st is over there right now. The 1st Infantry Division just left. But it will be rotational. Having said that, I also happen to serve in one of my pro bono nonprofit roles as a senior mentor to the 7th Army Training Command at Grafenwehr, and I was just over there with them 2 weeks ago in a conference they were having with their leadership. They asked me to come specifically because they are doing exactly the opposite of what I did as a commander in U.S. Army Europe, which when we were drawing down, what they're doing now is building up. How do you train that force, that U.S. military force that's in Europe for an extended period of time with a relatively small footprint of trainers? That doesn't answer your question directly, but I think you will see, right now there's about 30,000 soldiers and about 60,000 total forces. That's Army, Air Force, Special Ops, Marines in Europe. The Navy is kind of in and out of Europe, in chop and out chop, so you don't count those forces because it changes daily. But there's about 60,000 total military forces in Europe, less Navy. I think that will probably go to about 90 to 100,000 in the next year, with the majority of those being Army and Air Force, and the vast majority being Army. You have to ask one more question because your principal instructor and mentor is right there, and she had her hand raised.
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Do we have time for one more? Perfect.
She's giving you a thumbs up. Okay.
Sir, as an instructor...
Are you in the Soch department?
Yes, sir. I'm an instructor of international relations.
You know,
at
our
West
oldest
Point.
son was an instructor in the Soch department. Did you know that?
I did hear that, sir.
Did you know that I was in the more cerebral department at West Point when I taught there as a captain?
We can't all be Soch, sir.
I was in the PE department, and go ahead.
Sir, I wanted to ask, in part, to help with some of our students here. You spoke a lot about Mr. Putin and his influence in what's happening in Europe. we teach our students about the importance of individuals in IR, but we also teach them about the realist tradition of international relations. And those have sort of opposing views on whether or not people like Mr. Putin matter. Where do you fall on the line of the discussion or debate on the importance of individuals in IR? And do you think that if, as another student suggested, Mr. Putin was to disappear from the scene or to step away from it, would things continue on as they have, or is he integral to the decisions that Russia has been making?
I don't know. No, hey, seriously, it's a great question. How many people in here are War College graduates? A couple. Okay, so those of you who are War College graduates, you know what I'm about to say. The War College is a one-year course, and you can describe it in 4 succinct lessons. Always take the high ground. Logistics determine the art of the possible. Words are important, be precise. And the most important is personalities matter. Personalities matter. So now that I've just told you those 4 things, I'm going to give you a blessing. None of you have to go to the War College now because you've just learned the entire course. But personalities matter, especially personalities that have the majority of the world's nuclear weapons. And for those of you out there saying, we shouldn't worry about them, he hasn't used them yet, I got it. I'm guessing he'll never use those nuclear weapons, or his military will never use those nuclear weapons either. But you know what? I'm not 100% sure. And unless you're the decision maker that has to bear the brunt of a nuclear attack in Europe, you can casually say, let's send them ATACMs, let's screw that, let's set up a no-fly zone, let's do the... Okay, you can say that. But unless you're the guy behind the desk with the parking spot out front that you're in charge, you can't say that because you bear the responsibility. Personalities matter. This guy is a wild card. He's a criminal. He's a former KGB agent. And who knows if something happens to him, who might take his place? I don't know. That's a great way to end this thing, isn't it? With me saying, I don't know.
Sir, thank you so much. Ma'am, thank you for asking that question. If I was a betting woman, which I'm not because my mother disapproves, I would bet that that's going to come up on a social exam sometime this year. We'll see if the tankers answer.
Personalities matter, and I don't know. Okay?
Exactly.
That's all you got to say.
That is all the time we have. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for having me.